I'm going to try, by God's grace, to slow thought down some. We will introduce this kind of as we called it, or as the studies call it, chapters. We'll introduce that thought this evening. And let's see here. I've tripled up on my notes just in case I have a reference. I've got my notes. I've got Brother Tom's book. And I didn't want to bring in T.P. Simmons' book because that's about that thick. So we don't need to go through that. But I've got several things, and my notes are pretty skeleton because even though we are in this thought on God's will, it is fairly simple. It goes deep, and we're going to get somewhat deep, but we're going to, by God's grace, try to make a very simple application because it's not as complicated as we like to make it often. The will of God is our next study month, most likely a month to two in this chapter. And the will of God is something that we try to understand. We try to, and I'm trying to even think of how I would say it, question. It's just like Brother Daniel preached last night. It's something that we question. We make plans. So we get to the will of God. It's the sixth title, or sixth point in the book, in the study of systematic theology. Now, Brother Matt, how would you describe what God's will is? Okay. Brother Tyler, how would you describe what God's will is? Okay. Brother Keaton, would you care to take a stab at it? Okay. We hit on, really, we're all around where I was wanting you to go. So you see from the very beginning, God's will is quite simple. Now, somehow I got one of these slides out of order, and I'm not sure how. So we'll probably have a little. I got here and I realized I didn't create one. So I created one, and I think I put it in the wrong spot. So, but anyway, if we see here, God's ability, God's will is His ability to determine and choose all things from the beginning of the world. So we're where Brother Tyler was talking about. The pre-existing plan of God's choosing also represents God's will. And then where Brother Keaton was talking about, the purpose and plan of God's will. So how do you describe God's will? His ability to determine and choose all things from the beginning of the world. And I probably worded that wrong. That really should say from before the beginning of the world. That choosing from before the beginning of the world. It was pre-existing. That kind of contradicts myself. The pre-existing plan before the beginning of the world gives us the purpose and plan. Yep, here's my one that's out of order. On God's will, I'm just going to go over really quickly. I'm going to give you the topics that we are going to study on God's will. The qualities of God's will. And the qualities would be freedom, power, and immutability. And I know this is small. We're still going to have to play with the font. It's going to be hard to see at times. We're going to mess with it as much as we can. But freedom, power, immutability are qualities of God's will. By God's grace tonight, we'll get done with freedom. Freedom is, in one regard, one of the easiest ways to explain God's will. Freedom, believe it or not, this is 28-point font. It really is. Here, I keep stepping in your way. I'll get my fancy pointer out. Everybody loves when I get this out. But freedom, that's power and immutability. And I'm going to have it bigger in a second. God's will of purpose. God's will of appropriation. Kind of, if we wanted to look at it, the execution of the will. Differences between God's will of purpose and will of appropriation. This is going to get interesting. It's going to get deep. Okay. Let's get on in. Let's get on into qualities of God's will. The qualities of freedom. Now, go with me to Psalms chapter 115. I'm up here trying to hold this, marker, and if you know, but if it was a cane, it would hang easier. Anyway, Psalms 115. This is a beautiful verse that explains the freedom of God's will. But our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever he hath pleased. First off, God is in the heavens, indicating a freedom in and of itself. God's place represents God's will, represents God's power, represents God's freedom. God in the heavens indicates that he's high above us. Brother Dan said this morning in his message, when Moses went up, God came down. God still has to come down to us. There's freedom in that. I think that was Exodus chapter 34, if I remember. Or 34? Was that 20? It was 34. And he went back to 24, so that's what confused me. But God still had to come down. Man was limited by the bounds of only being able to go so far. But God's freedom allowed him to come down to man. So God's will has a freedom. God himself has freedom. He's high above us. It's like the passage in Isaiah, for his ways are not my ways, his thoughts are not my thoughts. And of course, I'm probably paraphrasing that or not doing quite justice as I should. But back to our verse here, but our God is in the heavens. Our God. Heavens being plural. All over. What we're going to do by God's grace tonight, we are going to go back and forth talking about freedom. We're going to talk about God's will and freedom and how God is not bound and we are. We see, as I've already went through, and you have to forgive me, some of this I'm going to do the best I can to try not to get ahead of this PowerPoint. It's not as easy as just doing a review. We've already seen the demonstration of God's free will. He does what he pleases. But our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever he hath pleased. That's a demonstration of God's free will. He's done what he pleased. Now, the next one might confuse you. If you think about it in the mind and in the eye that we behold. Anytime you see these two words, we get all panicky. All panicky. We are not bound, we are bound and don't have a free will. But in order for us to be bound, that means God has a free will. Now, I told you we're going to get deep and then try to come back out of it. Now, God has planned and purposed all things in His will from before the foundation of the world. So how can God have a free will if He has to follow it? Follow the things that He planned and purposed. Because He's independent and He has already used His free will to plan and purpose everything. It's a question that comes up often. God is not limited like we are. Now, in verse 3, but our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever He hath pleased. That hath there, we're just going to skip on to put these both up. That hath, we want to look at the present tense of hath. Looking at it in the context of where we're at. He hath. It meets us where we're at today. It meets every reader. From all time to ever read this passage, God has already done as God pleased. He is not currently writing His will. He's not waiting on you to make your next move so He can write His will. His will is so great, so powerful. He has so much freedom that when He planned and purposed for, He already knew what you were going to do. He hath done. Not only do we see in the hath done, the He hath and the He hath and the He hath done, not only do we see it in a present tense, but we know that this means that He's already done it for the future. And He did it for time past. That present tense, being present tense in the living scripture that it is, it's past, present, and future. It's already done. God's will, His freedom, has so much power and so much ability. What a wonderful thought. And furthermore, He hath worked freely and independently as He desired. He doesn't need anybody. God's will does not require us, right here, to be part of it. It doesn't require us to make a decision so He can choose. Now I'm already halfway there. I want to just, for those of you that weren't there today, go to Matthew chapter 28, and I'll explain to you what Brother Ellis said and the beauty that was in it. In Matthew chapter 28, we know it as the Great Commission in verses 18 through 20. The commandment to the church. Of course, Brother Ellis was talking about being missions by proxy, letting somebody else go, talking about being accused or talking about people in the thought of hardshell. In verse 18, and Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, all power is given unto me and in earth. That means that He works freely and independently as desired. Brother Ellis used the example that he had a young man that was saved. and then was deployed 6 to 12 months later. And he came back and he said, "Brother, I need to talk to you." He was saved, baptized. He said, "They're teaching me something different at the church I'm going to. They're telling me to go to anybody on the street, and in 5 minutes you can have them saved by just talking with them." Brother Ellis said, if you look at that passage right there, all power is given unto me in heaven and earth. It's not given to me or you. It's not given to me or you to get somebody saved in 5 minutes. We can't save anybody. That's why he worked independently and freely. If I could save somebody, why in the world would we need a church? Why would we need a church? He also said that everybody likes to stop right there. Essentially, that's what he said. Right? To those of you that hear, "Go ye therefore and teach all nations." That's where he got his missions by proxy. Hey, let's just pay missionaries. It's not Faith Baptist Church's job. If we can't support any more missionaries, that's okay. We don't need to have some great big wall of missionaries. You know, I pray one day the Lord allows me to be able to take my salary and support other people. And be able to help all the time support the spread of the gospel. But even if I do that, that doesn't mean that we stop. He used the term, the commandment, and in this was they were to go to Jerusalem. Brother Ellis said, we're to go to our own Jerusalem. Take the gospel with us. Water the seed. It's funny. Sister Peyton goes, we almost made it through a conference without somebody getting into Acts. Well, when you got a character like Paul, it's hard not to reference him because he was unfruitful ground. And we see, again, I'm not trying to re-preach that, but you look at his freedom. You look at him working freely and independently. You look in that passage and you see that all power, all authority is given to Jesus, not to us. And that's just another demonstration of his freedom, his independence, his not needing us. Now, I'll go into it more later. We have a role. We're to help in the building. Who was that? Is that Brother Hamill? Was that Brother Hamill that made that reference? Yeah, Brother Derek shaking and said, yeah. Yes, that was what his whole message was on, building with the Lord. That would make sense. That I hope that is recorded and can be found because it was a wonderful message. So that's part of the qualities of God's will. Let's go over to Psalms 135 and verse number 6. What I really loved in that message Brother Ellis preached is he said, we like to go with the go to all nations, teach them to observe all things, baptizing. And what he was talking about is the times where people want to go get people saved and then they're never found in the church again. And the need to teach them to observe all things, to disciple them. People that say they can't understand the Bible, if you were there and you heard, and I don't want to spoil the whole message because you really need to go listen to it, but you heard some of his analogies about raising children and talking about the simplicity of a newly saved and newly converted Christian. Just the comparisons of what it's like for being able to feed a new Christian and how much discipling we need to do. If you say you don't understand the Bible, you're just not trying. You're not really reading it. Psalms 135 and verse number 6. Excuse me. Whatsoever the Lord pleased, That did he in heaven and in earth, in the seas, and in all deep places. Now, can you go into the heavens? Sure, we can get an airplane. And if we were talking about the Old Testament heavens, yeah, we can be in the air. We can get in the sky. But can you go to heaven? Can you enter into heaven? All on your own? Can you get in the deep depths of the sea without being pressurized and squashed? I mean, just very simply. No. Can you be in all those places? No. So your very first example of God's will and freedom is that he's not bound. He's not bound the same way. He worked freely. And independently from all created beings to execute his will. That's why when you look at Psalms 135 and verse 6, it says, whatsoever the Lord pleased, that did he. Not that did his people. Not that did a king. Not that did Moses. Not that did any other figure that any other religious world or religious organization wants to worship. Whatsoever he pleased, that did he. This one is going to be small to read, but it's just the same as I just said. He does not depend on any created beings to execute or plan his will. I want you to read that again. I want you to write that down, and I want you to understand it. God, does not depend on any created beings to execute or plan his will. But what God does do is he had the foresight to be able to predestinate every which thing before the foundation of time, and he knows exactly what we're going to as his will is executed. He knows exactly where we're going to be. It's an interesting thought. But when I came to church today, before I came to church today, Alyssa and I were talking about how it was cold. She's going to laugh. Believe it or not, I said it was cold. I know. So I put on a sweater. Something happened. It shrunk and it didn't fit. What are you laughing at? Anyway. Then I put on a vest. She says, that doesn't look good. Why don't you just put the sport coat you had on? I said, because it's too small. It doesn't want a button. And Thanksgiving's tomorrow. Christmas is right around the corner. Then there's New Year's. But I thought about putting each and every one of those things on. I chose what I wore, kind of. She told me what to wear. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I was in control of what I was going to wear for the most part. God still knew what I was going to wear. The little details in God's will are important. Now, we may call that liberty. And I'm not necessarily going there yet. But even in our own liberty, if we want to call it that way, that liberty is still given by God to execute his will because he's independent from us. And he knows the depth that we cannot understand. He knows exactly when you go out there and turn your car and it doesn't start because of a chain of events that happen in somebody else's life to keep you from danger. Now, we like to use the term that we can get ahead of God, that we can do things without God, and I'm not going to get there yet. when we get to the execution of God's will. We'll talk more about that. Let me be clear, you can never get ahead of God. But you sure can feel like it. And He'll sure let you feel like it. And why is that? For our learning. Our in-depth need, inherent need to learn. This one is kind of hard to explain, but God is free. You have to understand the first three words. God is free. From the execution and formation of His will, again, it's talking about the dependency and showing that He's not dependent on us. God is free because Him and His will existed before all of us did. And because of this very passage, whatsoever the Lord pleased, that did He in heaven and in earth, in the seas, and in all deep places. That verse shows that God is absolutely sovereign in all that He does, all that He did, and all that He will do. I passed a church the other day that said on the sign, God is still writing your story. Boy, that's real motivational to make you think that you can change something that's happened in your life. But the reality is, it's already done. It's already done. It's preordained. It's predetermined. Some people would say, well, God can't sin, so how can God let me sin in my life and get away from Him? You have to give me a couple weeks. I can't cover it all in one night. But I will tell you, for all things work together for good to them that love God. Brother Daniel brought that out so wonderfully, and it's something for us to think about, that just because bad things happen to us doesn't mean it's for the greater good of our soul, of our life, and of our worship. It changes us. It forms us. It makes us stronger, better servants. Your story's already written. Now, how does our human nature, or let's say our human will, let's get a little loose and liberal with it, if we should. How does our human will differ from God's will? Well, let me show you. Go to Genesis. And I'll explain. In Genesis chapter 2, I want to show you something that I was meditating on. Genesis chapter 2, verse number 16. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree in the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Now we are opening up, I'm just going to warn you, we're opening up a can of worms in this passage. People go, well, this passage right here, that's the difference in man's will and God's will. Man decided to sin because God could not sin. And then they say, well, the earth was different. We were different. Our relationship with God was different. Here's what you got to understand. From a very early point in creation, if you go and read that verse, what is God doing? And the Lord commanded the man, saying, of every tree in the garden thou mayest freely eat. Uh-oh. What's coming? But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. Man was perfect. Man was sinless. Man had everything that they needed. Man still had boundaries. Man was not God. Made in the image of God was not God. Man still had boundaries. From the time of perfection upon the human race, in this passage, they were still said not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God still worked in His will freely and independently, did not depend on man. So then the question goes, well, how can God allow us to fall into sin fall out of His grace? How could God allow us to sin? Well, that's where you got to understand God's freedom of His will. Man wasn't alone in the garden. We've talked about the attributes of God. God is just. And what we find in that is very simply that, I'm trying to think how I can even say it simpler. As part of God's plan, His plan had to start before. More things happened before the sin of Adam and Eve. The devil had to fall. The angels don't experience grace. They learn from us. They don't understand what grace is. They don't have grace. The devil had to fall. That fallen angel had to fall. That had to be preordained. That's another direction, if you can see, God's power. It's not just the species of us. The angel had to fall. God allowed the angel to be tempted. God knew that man was going to fall. The allowing of, how we would say, bad things happening to good people and how God uses it for His good, then people go, well, how would God allow so many people to not be saved? And again, I'm going to give you something to chew on. I'm not going to give you all the answers yet. Some of them because I'm still learning how to explain them. There's a lot of thoughts. See how easy we can go, why God, to His will? Without remembering that His will is independent. It differs from us. It's different from us. Creation is fully dependent on God. It is fully dependent. Has to be. We've established that creation scientifically is true. There are things about this life that cannot be explained but by God. Creation is fully dependent on God. We see that in Genesis 2:16 and 17. God put Adam and Eve in the garden and says, you can eat of everything but this right here. There is still a boundary. There was still a line that couldn't be crossed. And there was still disobedience. Now, I'm giving you a lot, and I mean a lot, to think about. We were limited in knowledge at the very beginning. That shows you God's freedom and power. We didn't know the boundaries. that was God's will. We were limited from the beginning. Limited on power. Could we be equals with God? Funny, I always had this. A lot of us in this room are, thank goodness our kids probably aren't anymore, but a lot of us in this room are Disney kids. We grew up in the Disney movie era. For Friday night, Disney Channel would have a new movie on, or maybe I'm the only one that does. Shows you we watched a lot of TV growing up, especially when it got dark. Friday nights, right? But before that, most of you will remember the movie Aladdin. This sounds silly, but I'm going somewhere with it. The whole point of the movie Aladdin was the genie in the bottle, and then somebody had made a wish to be the most powerful genie, and the movie gets defeated because they find out that you can't be the most powerful genie without somebody giving you the power. When I think about God and God's will and God's power, for some reason, as a kid, and maybe that's a bad thing, maybe that's showing us that we should be careful what our kids watch, right? But for some reason, that's what's ingrained in my mind. That all power has to be given, but you can't have all power when the power is given. God's will was laid out. We're instruments that He has chosen to use for His time. Let me ask you a question. Why are you living today? Why do you live in this generation? Why weren't you born during the Civil War? Why weren't you born, let's just say, 5,000 years ago, in the early days of this earth? Why weren't you one of the Sanhedrin that crucified Christ? Were you just born by happenstance? However you came to this earth, was it by happenstance? Or is it by God's marvelous, wonderful will that placed you where you were at every step of your life, that brought you here to do whatsoever He hath desired? And you don't know what tomorrow is. You don't know when your last breath is going to be. You think about this church, it's an easy analogy because we have time that we can go backwards. But you think about this church, there was a moment in time where the church looked like it was going to close its doors. Could the church have closed its doors? No. But why did God allow the church to get to the point where there was no people? Where it felt like it was all alone. It felt like there was no people. It didn't make sense. For today. For Sunday. For a Bible conference in 2025. To see every pew full. To see a soul saved. To not know what those seeds were going to do for years to come. Can you ask the question, why did God do this? Can you really? You're going through a tough time. Life gets you down. Believe me, it happens to all of us. Can you really say at all, for any reason, why God? Or should you understand that God's nature is free? That God has planned and purposed every step of your life, that every difficulty you have, every tribulation you have, every very difficult day you face has been given to you like a gift. Think about this. The backsliding that you do, God already knew it was going to happen. There is no surprise to God. There is no change to God. You will never catch God off guard. Because think about this. If you don't understand what I'm saying tonight, if you could surprise God, make him have to rewrite his will for your life, for my life, make him have to change what was already written down, does God then have absolute power and freedom? No. Every trial, every triumph, every difficult, every step we take, he knows. Why don't we go to him? Why do me, why do I try to fix everything when I can't fix it anyway? He's free. I'm not. Here's what I found incredibly interesting. In Genesis chapter 2, they were already bound by sin before sin entered the world. You follow me? In verse 17, the boundary is sin. Sin hadn't entered the human race, but sin was present. Now let me ask you one big question. Now, why in the world would God create a whole species of people, a whole land, to plummet it into sin, to destroy it in a flood, to send, and we just call it what it is, to send people to hell and only send some to heaven? Because he does whatsoever he pleases. If we try to understand that, other than the thought of he does whatsoever he pleases, you will be miserable. You have to submit to the greater and higher being and the freedom of God's will. You go through a tough time. I know there are many people in this room tonight that are going through a tough time. And just like Brother Daniel said, you're either faking it, you're denying it, and acting like it's okay. I know there's people in this room going through a rough time. No matter if you fall into that category of faking it or denying it. You must submit to God's will for your life. Now you're going, now you just said that God's already pre-planned and purposed it. Yeah, and he's pre-planned and purposed your submission too. You're going to do it. You're going to do it one way or the other. But he's even pre-planned when you're going to submit and do it happily. Stop fighting. Stop trying to change things. Stop trying to take control. Look with your eyes wide open. See what you can learn from God's will. See what you can learn in true worship. See what you can learn in true service. We are here, as they said at the conference, some said it directly, many said it indirectly, we are here to serve God. We are not here to serve us. Folks, that's why we get miserable. Because we think that our human nature, we look for how our nature can match up with God's will, and then we expect to be happy about it. And you can't be. Human nature was bound by sin before it ever entered the world, because there was a boundary in which, when you crossed over, there was sin. Whether they were on the outside of the boundary or the inside of the boundary, they were still bound to a certain place by sin, whereas God was not. We're bound by each other. We're bound by each other. We're bound by our peers. What do you mean? Again, Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 and 17. Adam and Eve. Eve desired the fruit. Gave it to Adam. And they sinned. God is not bound to anybody. It's another way our nature changes. We're bound by environment. Look at all of these ways that mine and your nature I'll just hit it one more time, maybe. Look at how many ways we are unable to operate independently by our environment, by our peers, by sin. Now let me ask you all a question. When you talk about God's will, when you talk about getting away from the Lord, we get all bent out of shape. Somebody said you can get away from the Lord. Wrong people are going to take that as you saying you have free will. But what I'm telling you is, when we use the term that we can get away from the Lord, first and foremost, it's miserable. Because the separation is huge. There's no closeness. You can't worship. What separates us from God is not His will in a way, as it is our nature, our mind, our selfishness, our fleshly desires, our sin. You know, it's terrifying to preach on God's will. I just want to let you all know. Terrifying. Because I'm still learning just as much as you are. And there's many in the room that may know more than me. But it makes me think about it this way. If we want to talk about losing that closeness, being separated from God, being out of the will of God, who are we looking at as the problem? Who are we looking at as the source of our misery? It's got to be our nature. because it's not going to be God. Now, take that in a box and shake it up and try to pull that apart. The trials and tribulations that we go through are part of God's will. The very difficulties that we go through are part of God's will. It's our human nature that makes us feel separate. Now, God can't sin. That's because our nature is sin. I hope you follow me. Folks, our human nature differs from the freedom of God because it has no freedom. That's why free will doesn't exist. That's why we like to move things around, and you can call it liberty, you can call it whatever you want. God may give you some form of liberty as a freedom of choice, but God has everything planned out. That liberty in which we'll call it, right? Is God's power giving you the ability to think you choose your own way. Yet, all the while, God knows where you're at. Exactly which spot in the roadmap of your life you're at. Because He is the grand designer of it all. And unfortunately, not everybody that are living in this world today, not everybody get to be saved by the marvelous grace of our loving Savior. Not everybody gets to be baptized and placed in a true New Testament independent Baptist church. Now ask why. Why are you? Because you don't know. And you don't know that any more than you know the difficulties you'll face tomorrow. You know, being ordained and being a pastor, my greatest fear was not contending for the faith. And I would hold back on messages, and I would fight on messages, and I would fight on things I would say. And I try to be careful about my wording, and I still do. Don't hear me wrong. Because I didn't want to be a hypocrite. And we should have a desire to not to be a hypocrite, right? But we must understand that it's God that gave us the grace and will give us the grace and will sustain us in the ways in which He has willed to sustain us. We would do better as a people to not worry about tomorrow. If we would just quit worrying about tomorrow and focus on serving today, you know what's going to happen? You'll put this old nature to bed and you'll serve the Lord with gladness. But we've got to stop. We have to stop focusing on tomorrow. We haven't even made it through today yet. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving. We got lots of plans, I'm sure. One way or the other, you have some plan for tomorrow. We don't even know if we're going to make it home. With what kind of zeal did we wake up with today to strive to serve the Lord? Because I bet it's been a battle today for some. It's been a battle for me. From the moment I woke up, it's been a battle. Have we strived to serve the Lord today? any age. If you're saved today, have you strived to serve the Lord? I'm not even on my notes anymore. I'm trying not to get too far ahead. And I certainly didn't know what time it was. That's all the notes I had. Because I thought, yeah, that should take me about 35 minutes. Maybe 40. I hope you see it. I hope you see how blessed we are to have God's will. We'd be lost without it. I hope you see the beauty and the freedom of God's will. And more than anything, for many of us that are in this room that are struggling tonight, that are struggling with the unknowns of the future, may you wake up tomorrow and strive to serve the Lord. Brother Daniel was telling a story back in 2015. Their 3 oldest kids were there, and they had went and took another church. Sister Kathy actually alluded to it more with Alyssa and I today at the meal. But they had taken a new mission work, and they got down to the last $40 that they had. Brother Daniel built that program, which we all know that he teaches Spanish to English-speaking missionaries. And he built that program and has down to his last $40, no support, 3 kids and a wife. He got in his vehicle and he drove, and he talks about how they went and they just prayed and they were just crying because they were in that despair. What's going to happen next? We think it's bad when we run short. We still got a roof over our head. We got a vehicle, or we have somebody that can help us. We have all the things that we really need. When we're striving to serve the Lord, have we ever really went without? Sure, it got uncomfortable and tight and difficult, and we didn't like it, but have we went without? And I was even thinking the faithfulness, and he took his money, cashed in the last of his food. They prayed. And I think he said, what did he say? The phone, he got back and somebody called and wanted to teach but couldn't pay the full rate. And he said, well, absolutely. And then he took 9 or 10 phone calls that night of people saying, hey, we've been blessed. We want to support you. Hey, we want to support you. Hey, we want to support you. And he said, I built the program that gave us $100. But the Lord, of course, the Lord helped him build the program, and he wasn't saying that, but the Lord did all of this. Boy, we should be thankful for the will of God. All his planning and purposing and everything he's done. If you leave here tonight, I encourage you, do not be discouraged. Do not be discouraged when the financial math of running a household does not add up. Do not be discouraged when you wake up in the morning and things don't go your way. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord that you are here today. Praise the Lord that you are saved. Find the joy of your salvation. Find the joy of your church membership. Find the joy of where you're at. Find the joy in the Lord, because that will be your strength. We have a different nature. It's hard, folks. I struggle with it as much as you do. But thank God for His will. We'll end there tonight. We'll close with a word of prayer. And Lord willing, we'll be back